I was mocked at my own sister's wedding. The server thought I was staff, and Rachel laughed in front of everyone, calling me a janitor like it was a joke. They sat me at the back by the kitchen, gave me nothing but a piece of bread, while my parents raised glasses as if I did not exist. People whispered eyes slid past me, and I stayed silent, holding a napkin in my fist. But when the sheriff stood up and called my name, the room froze. You want to know why the man with the badge told 200 guests I was the one who carried his daughter out of the fire? This is not just about humiliation. It is about finally being seen, about justice that no one in my family ever believed I would claim. The December air in Dallas carried the kind of chill that slid right through fabric. I pulled my coat tighter as I stepped out of the cab and looked up at the glowing facade of the Trinity River Hotel. Rachel's wedding sparkled from every corner of the lobby valet. Attendants rushing photographers, snapping pictures of laughing guests in gowns that shimmered under chandeliers. I paused for a moment, steadying myself before walking through the glass doors. The scent of roses and champagne hung thick in the lobby. Guests clustered near the grand staircase, their voices floating with excitement. I held a small card in my hand, my only gift, and tried to remind myself that I had every right to be here. A young server approached, glancing at my plain navy dress. He stopped, tilted his head, and asked if I should head to the staff corridor. My stomach clenched. Before I could answer, Rachel's voice carried across the room, bright and sharp. She swept toward me in her satin gown, diamonds at her ears, veil trailing like a wave of silk. She let her eyes move over me slowly, the corners of her mouth curling. She said it suited me, that janitor look. A ripple of laughter ran through the guests nearby. Some smirked, others turned away, but no one spoke for me. I searched instinctively for my parents. My father Charles adjusted his tie and fixed his gaze on the stage ahead. My mother Linda smoothed her skirt and deliberately looked down at her glass of champagne. Neither of them even blinked in my direction. The message was clear. I was alone. The usher with the seating chart forced a polite smile as he guided me past rows of elegantly dressed tables. I walked past white linen cloths and crystal glasses catching the light. At the front, Rachel and her fiancé's names gleamed in bold print. My parents were seated just behind them. Table numbers climbed down the line until my eyes found mine. Table 14. The usher led me past the glow of chandeliers and into the far back of the ballroom. The table was tucked beside the swinging doors of the kitchen. The cloth was wrinkled, the silverware mismatched. At the center sat a single plate with a plain piece of bread. The noise of servers shouting orders and trays clattering drowned out the music. I lowered myself into the chair and rested my hands in my lap. The smell of roasted lamb and garlic butter drifted from the kitchen, mocking the stale bread in front of me. A server passing by gave me a quick glance of pity before disappearing again. I lifted my eyes and let them scan the room. Rachel stood near the head table, radiant, a flute of champagne raised high. My parents sat only a few feet away from her, smiling for photographs, laughing with old friends. None of them looked back toward me. It was as if I did not exist. I pressed the napkin between my hands until the fabric bunched my knuckles, paling. Heat pulsed through my chest, not from shame, but from something heavier, a quiet fire that made my shoulders square. I fixed my gaze on the stage, draped in roses, the place where vows would soon be spoken and applause would thunder. My lips tightened into a thin line. They thought this was my place, forgotten in the shadows, but they had no idea what silence can hold. The band struck the opening notes of a song as more guests were ushered to their seats. Laughter rose again, glasses clinked, music swelled. I stayed still, my hands gripping the napkin like a secret I refused to let go. My eyes never left the stage. The sound of the band faded into the distance, and I felt myself slip back to another holiday years earlier. It was Thanksgiving of 2015, and the dining room of my parents' house in San Antonio smelled of roasted turkey and cinnamon pie. Every relative we had seemed to be crammed into that space, their voices rising over football on the television silverware, clinking wine glasses raised. I had walked in that night carrying a plaque from the Texas State Education Association, my name etched in gold as Employee of the Year. My hands trembled with pride as I held it out, waiting for them to see me, to notice that I had achieved something no one in our family had before. I barely had time to set the plaque on the sideboard before Rachel lifted her hand, the sparkle of a diamond ring catching every bit of light in the room. The entire table gasped, and my mother was the first to leap to her feet. She clapped her hands together, her voice thick with joy, as she announced that Rachel was finally engaged. My father stood next to her, his eyes wet with pride as he patted Rachel's shoulder. A chorus of congratulations erupted around the table. Chairs scraped, relatives crowded around, everyone reaching to touch Rachel's hand, to admire the cut of the diamond, to tell her she was destined for happiness. I stood frozen by the door with my plaque pressed against my side, the words on it suddenly meaningless. No one asked me what I had won. No one asked how I had earned it. My aunt brushed past me, nearly knocking the plaque from my hand, just to get a better look at Rachel's ring. My uncle slapped my father on the back and said he had raised a perfect daughter. I tried to steady my breathing, tried to remind myself that my accomplishment mattered, even if no one else cared. But the laughter around the table drowned out that thought until it was gone. Later that night, when the plates were empty and the wine bottles scattered, I picked up my plaque from where I had left it. It had a greasy fingerprint smudged across the corner. No one even noticed when I slipped out the back door. I remember the cold air hitting my face sharper than the one tonight, and I remember thinking that silence might be easier than trying to speak in a room where my voice would never carry. But that was not the first time I had been erased. In 2010, I was a senior in high school, clutching a letter of acceptance from the University of Texas, along with a scholarship check. I had planned to use it to cover books and living expenses, a chance to start fresh in Austin. My father called me into his office the day the check arrived. He cleared his throat, avoided my eyes, and said that Rachel had an opportunity to open a small boutique with one of her friends. He said she needed capital and that the family had decided it made sense to use my scholarship money for her dream. I argued until my throat hurt. My mother insisted that I was resilient, that I could always apply for loans or pick up extra work. Rachel stood in the doorway, not once looking guilty, only smiling faintly as if the decision was already written. A week later, the check was deposited into her account. The boutique closed within a year, debts piled up, and the whole thing vanished like it had never existed. My scholarship never returned. I worked nights cleaning classrooms and scrubbing cafeteria floors to pay my way through community college instead. Every time I pushed a mop across the tile, I reminded myself that it was supposed to be different, that I was supposed to be at a university library, studying, not inhaling bleach fumes. But no one in my family ever acknowledged what they had taken. The ballroom came back into focus. Laughter rang around me again, and Rachel's voice lifted above the music, smooth and confident, just like that Thanksgiving night. My hands tightened around the napkin on my lap until my knuckles ached. The memories of smudged plaques and stolen scholarships pressed against my chest with the same weight as the bread sitting untouched on my plate. I whispered to myself words I had never dared to say out loud. I had never been seen, only used. The lights dimmed slightly as the coordinator signaled for guests to prepare for the procession. I straightened in my chair, the napkin still balled in my fist. Whatever role they thought I would play tonight, I knew the moment was coming when silence would no longer be enough. When I closed my eyes in that ballroom, I could still smell the disinfectant that clung to my clothes after long nights at Westlake High. Since 2015, I had pushed brooms down those hallways, emptied trash bins, scrubbed desks covered in graffiti. My paycheck barely covered rent, but it kept me standing on my own 2 feet. Some mornings I would pause in front of the glass trophy cases in the lobby and wonder if any of my own victories would ever be displayed that way. The students barely noticed me, except when they wanted to laugh at the janitor with calloused hands. Teachers nodded politely, but kept moving. There were nights I stayed later than anyone, sweeping in silence, my reflection following me across the waxed floor. It was not only the job. On weekends I volunteered at the Haven Shelter downtown. I stocked canned food, folded blankets, and listened to stories of people who had lost everything. They saw me differently than my family ever had. To them, I was not invisible. I was someone who showed up. The night of the fire in 2018 still returned to me in fragments. Smoke rolled through the east wing of the shelter where a group of children had been waiting for their parents. I had been stacking boxes when alarms shrieked. Everyone panicked, rushing for the doors. I heard a scream high and thin and found a girl trapped by a collapsed shelf. Heat pressed against my skin as I pulled debris away, lifting her into my arms. Her face was streaked with ash and tears. Outside, paramedics swarmed. I handed her to a man in uniform who clutched her like he had nearly lost his world. Sheriff Tom Reynolds thanked me with a voice that cracked, saying I had saved his daughter's life. That night I went home smelling of smoke, my hair singed at the edges, my palms raw. I sat alone in my apartment staring at my blistered skin, realizing no one in my family would ever know or care. When I finally told my mother days later, she brushed it aside. She said it was good I had been there, but reminded me that cleaning jobs did not build a future. Those words drilled into me again as I sat at the wedding table. The laughter around me blurred. I could hear my mother's voice in my head telling me no one respected janitors, that I should find a way out before people started pitying me. Yet the sheriff himself had looked me in the eye and told me I had done something that mattered. I knew whose voice I believed. My phone buzzed in my purse. Tyler's name lit the screen. I slipped out into the hallway to answer. His voice was steady the way it always was when I felt shaken. He asked if I was hanging in there. I told him where I was seated, and he sighed. He reminded me that I had already proven my worth, that this town respected me, even if my family never would. I leaned against the cool marble wall, listening, letting his words push back against the noise in my head. I returned to the ballroom, sliding back into my chair. I looked down at the piece of bread on the plate in front of me. My mother's words echoed once more, sharp and dismissive, but I felt them twist inside me into something different. What she thought was worthless had already saved a life. What she mocked was the very thing that gave me power. The coordinator's voice cut through the crowd, announcing that the ceremony would soon begin. Guests shifted in their seats, laughter rising again, cameras flashing. I folded the napkin in my lap, my hands steady this time. Whatever came next, I knew I carried a truth no one at that head table could erase. That night in my apartment, the silence was louder than the music had been at the ballroom. I set my purse on the counter and switched on the small lamp in the corner. The yellow glow filled the room with a tired kind of warmth. I pulled the drawer of my desk open and took out the small black USB drive I had guarded for years. On it were files Tyler had prepared, copies of official letters, and a scanned certificate naming me a community hero in 2018. My thumb brushed over the plastic surface as if it carried heat. I sat down at the table and opened my laptop. The screen lit my face while I clicked through folders, pulling up the scanned award, the sheriff's signature, the city seal pressed into the paper. My chest rose and fell slowly. I had tucked this away like a secret, afraid it would never matter. Tonight it felt like a weapon waiting to be used. The phone rang and Michael's name appeared. For a moment I thought of ignoring it, but I pressed accept and held it to my ear. His voice carried hesitation, the same tone he had used the last time we argued. He said he had heard from an old friend that Rachel was getting married, and that I would be there. He asked if I was doing all right. I told him quietly that my family had seated me at a table by the kitchen with nothing but a piece of bread. He was silent for a beat. Then he said he was sorry that it sounded like them. I could almost see his face, the way he used to look at me, when he wanted to fix everything but knew he could not. He reminded me of the time years ago when he came to dinner, and my mother asked him what his father did for a living. When he answered that his dad was a mechanic, she smiled thinly and changed the subject. Later that night, my father pulled me aside and asked why I was wasting my time. Michael said he never forgot that feeling, that he had been judged before he even finished his plate. I clenched the edge of the desk. I told him they had ruined what we had. I said they had destroyed both of us. My voice surprised me with how steady it sounded. Then I told him it was my turn now. He whispered my name, but I ended the call before he could say more. The room felt heavier after the line went dead, but I pushed the weight aside. I closed the laptop and slid the USB back into its case, then slipped it into my purse. I stood in front of the mirror by the door, staring at the woman reflected there. My hair was tied back loosely, my eyes tired from years of swallowing silence, but the set of my jaw was sharp. I pulled a small stack of papers from the drawer. Tyler had printed statutes notes in the margins, reminders of rights that could not be ignored. He had told me once that evidence means nothing if you keep it hidden. I spread the pages across the desk, reading until the words blurred. The clock ticked past midnight. I pressed the documents together, slipped them into a folder, and placed it beside my purse. I ran water into a glass and drank it down, letting the cold slide through me. Then I turned out the lamp. In the dark, I stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker across the highway. My breath fogged the glass. I thought of Rachel's smile when she mocked me, and of my mother's eyes sliding past me as if I were a stranger. The memory burned, but it did not weaken me. It carved a path forward. I crawled into bed, the folder, and USB waiting on the chair beside me. Sleep was shallow, broken by dreams of smoke and applause, and faces turning in shock. Each time I opened my eyes, I felt the same truth pulsing stronger. Morning would bring the ceremony. Morning would bring my chance. The ballroom at the Riverwalk Grand looked like it had been lifted from a movie. Gold chandeliers glowed against mirrored walls, roses draped across every table, and the sound of a string quartet floated above the clinking of glasses. Rachel moved through the crowd like royalty, her gown shimmering under the lights, her veil pinned with tiny crystals. People turned their heads when she passed, their faces bright with admiration. She soaked it in as if she had been waiting her whole life for this stage. I sat at my table near the kitchen doors, the wrinkled cloth and single piece of bread mocking me more loudly than any words could. I watched my parents as they stood near the front, raising glasses of champagne, smiling as though they had won something themselves. My father's arm rested proudly on Rachel's shoulder. My mother's laughter rang out sharp and high, every bit of it for Rachel. A man at the next table leaned toward my mother and asked where I was sitting. His voice carried just enough for me to hear. My mother smiled and said with a tilt of her head that I was better suited behind the scenes. Her words dropped into the air like stones, casual and cruel. He chuckled and turned back to his drink. My phone buzzed against the table. I looked down, and the message flashed across the screen. "Enjoy your janitor meal." Rachel had taken the time in the middle of her own wedding to make sure I felt smaller than the piece of bread in front of me. The blood in my hands rushed hot. I tightened my grip around the phone until my knuckles whitened. The walls of the ballroom seemed to close and voices, swirling, laughter rising, but none of it reached me. I pushed back my chair. The legs scraped against the tile sharp enough that a few heads turned. I did not care. I stood and straightened my shoulders. I felt the phone digging into my palm, the edges sharp, grounding me. I turned away from the table, away from the smell of food I was not meant to eat, and walked toward the back corridor. Each step rang like a drumbeat, my pulse matching it. No one stopped me. The servers rushed past with trays, the guests leaned into their conversations, and my family pretended not to see. I reached the hallway where the light dimmed and the music softened. For the first time that night, my lungs filled fully. I leaned against the cool wall and let the phone hang at my side. The sting of Rachel's words lingered, but beneath it something stronger had taken root. I had been silent too many times. I had let them cut me down, dismiss me, erase me. Not tonight. I lifted my head and looked back through the open doorway into the ballroom. Rachel laughed under the chandelier, my parents glowing with pride beside her. The sight no longer carved into me the way it once had. It sharpened me. The napkin I had carried earlier was still balled in my other hand. I squeezed it until the fabric was tight between my fingers. My lips pressed together, not trembling but firm. It was time. The orchestra swelled as the coordinator signaled for the wedding party to prepare. Guests settled into their seats, unaware of what was shifting just beyond the door. I straightened my back, slipped the phone into my purse, and stepped away from the wall. Whatever role they thought I would play, it would not be the silent one anymore. The music slowed as the ceremony began, and guests shifted in their chairs, all eyes drawn to the white roses draped over the arch at the front of the ballroom. I slipped back into my seat, the hum of voices falling to a hush. Rachel walked down the aisle on my father's arm, her smile serene, as though the world had been built for this single moment. My mother dabbed at the corner of her eyes with a tissue proud and glowing. The officiant spoke in a practiced voice about love and unity, words that floated past me without meaning. I stared at the candles flickering at the altar, letting their light blur. Applause broke when Rachel and her groom exchanged vows. Guests leaned forward, some snapping photos, others whispering. I sat still, hands clasped in my lap, the napkin now folded neatly, my face calm. After the ceremony, the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone. He welcomed everyone to the reception, listing the order of speeches. My chest tightened as he called the names of friends, cousins, even a neighbor who had known Rachel since childhood. The list kept going, one name after another, but mine never came. I heard a ripple of murmurs near me. A woman at the next table leaned to her husband, her voice carrying in the hush. She asked why the older sister was not speaking. The husband glanced at me with a faint smirk and whispered that maybe I had nothing worth saying. I felt their eyes on me, curious and sharp, as though I were an exhibit behind glass. Rachel beamed from her chair at the head table, laughing at each toast, clapping for each story told about her charm, her success, her kindness. My parents raised their glasses, nodding along faces lit with pride. Not once did they look toward me. It was as if I was not even seated in the same room. My stomach churned. I thought of the scholarship they had taken, of the award, smudged and ignored, of Michael dismissed before he had finished a meal. The years of silence pressed against me heavy as stone. Around me the room blurred into a haze of candlelight and perfume. I shifted in my chair, reaching into my purse. My fingers brushed against the smooth edge of the USB drive Tyler had given me. The air seemed to still as I pulled it into my palm, small but solid, a weight that carried everything they had refused to acknowledge. My hand trembled not with fear, but with the release of years I had swallowed. I closed my fist around it until my nails dug into my skin. My gaze lifted to the stage where the microphone waited, where voices that dismissed me filled the air. The applause swelled again for Rachel as another guest finished speaking. She glanced across the room, her eyes skimming past me as though I were furniture. My mother leaned into my father's ear, whispering, and they both laughed softly. I straightened in my chair. The noise around me faded, the sting of their laughter turning into a single line of thought running clear through my chest. My silence had served them long enough. I pressed the USB tighter in my hand, feeling the faint ridge of the logo beneath my thumb. My breathing slowed, steady, every inhale deliberate. My eyes fixed on the microphone at the front, my shoulders set. It was only a matter of time before that silence broke. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone and announced that a special guest would close the speeches. Heads turned toward the front as Sheriff Tom Reynolds rose from his seat. His presence carried weight, even in a room filled with wealthy donors and polished politicians. The chatter died down as he walked to the stage, his boots sounding steady against the marble floor. He thanked the couple and offered a few words about family and community. His voice was calm, measured, the kind of tone that could quiet a crowd without effort. Then he paused, scanning the room, his eyes settling on me at the back table. I froze, the USB still clenched in my palm. He cleared his throat and said he wanted to recognize someone in the room. He called my name. For a moment it felt like the air had been punched out of my lungs. Every face turned, every chair shifted in my direction. I pushed myself up slowly, my knees stiff, the napkin sliding off my lap onto the floor. My heart pounded, but I lifted my chin. Sheriff Reynolds spoke again, his voice carrying across the silence. In 2018, during the fire at the Haven shelter, he said his daughter had been trapped inside. He said there had been no time, that smoke had filled the hallways and panic had taken over. Then he told them it was me who carried her out, covered in soot, arms shaking but refusing to let her go. The room was still as stone. I could hear the faint hum of the lights above the soft clink of a glass as someone's hand trembled against it. He said his family never forgot what I had done, that my work that night was not janitorial or small or invisible. He said it was the act of an unsung hero. I felt my throat tighten as his words filled the air. My mother's hand froze on her champagne glass. My father leaned forward, lips parted, but no sound came. Rachel sat with her mouth set in a line, the shine of her gown unable to shield her from the weight of silence pressing in. Sheriff Reynolds lifted his glass. He told the room that titles did not define character, that uniforms did not measure courage, and that sometimes the ones ignored were the very people who carried others out of fire. He ended with my name clear and firm, leaving it to hang in the air like a banner. For a breath, the ballroom stayed frozen, as if no one knew how to respond. Then the applause began, scattered at first, then swelling until the walls shook with it. Guests rose to their feet, clapping, some turning toward me with eyes wide as if seeing me for the first time. The sound filled my chest, louder than years of silence ever had. I stood straighter, blinking back the burn in my eyes, refusing to let tears blur the moment. My hands loosened, the USB falling back into my purse, no longer needed as proof. The proof was in the words spoken aloud, undeniable, impossible to erase. My gaze met Rachel's across the room. She sat rigid, her face pale, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. My mother lowered her eyes. My father pressed his lips together, both robbed of words. I drew in a long breath and lifted my head higher. The heat of humiliation I had carried all night shifted into something sharp and clean. For the first time in years, I felt visible, not for what they called me, but for what I had done. The applause continued, as if it would never end. And in that thunder, I knew the night was not finished yet. Rachel's eyes dropped to the floor as the applause finally ebbed. Her shoulders sagged under the weight of silence, her hands frozen on the stem of her glass. My mother Linda stood abruptly, her face flushed, and reached toward Sheriff Reynolds as he stepped down from the stage. She tried to catch his arm, her words desperate, but he brushed past her without pause. He offered only a polite nod and kept walking, leaving her hand hanging in the air. My father Charles sat stiff in his chair, his jaw locked, his pride cracked in front of 200 witnesses. He stared at the tablecloth as if answers might be written in its folds, unwilling to meet my gaze or anyone else's. The clinking of glasses started again, but in a different rhythm, an awkward shuffle as people whispered. I felt the shift of the room. Eyes that once skimmed over me now followed me with a new kind of curiosity, the kind that stung, but also freed me. I stood straighter and adjusted the strap of my purse. Through the crowd, I saw Michael. He had slipped into the back unnoticed earlier, but now he stepped forward. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the noise, but I heard him. He said he regretted leaving me, that he wished he had stood by me when my family pushed him out. I held his gaze for a moment. Memories of late nights we once shared flickered, followed quickly by the words, "My parents had spoken to poison us." I let the ache rise and fall like a tide. I told him softly that I did not need anyone's approval anymore, not even his. I said I was enough on my own. His eyes dropped, and he nodded once before stepping aside. I walked past the head table, where Rachel sat motionless, her gown shimmering under the lights, but her face pale, her lips pressed tight. For years I had bent myself smaller so she could shine brighter. Tonight the light was no longer hers to control. The ballroom doors opened as I pushed them wide. The cold night air swept against my face, sharp and clean. Snowflakes drifted down over Austin, soft against the pavement, melting on my skin. I stepped into it, my heels crunching against the thin layer of white. Each step felt heavier with release, lighter with truth. Behind me the music began again, muffled through the doors, but it no longer held me. Ahead the street stretched quiet, lined with glowing lamps, each one casting a pool of light on the snow. I pulled my coat tighter and lifted my chin. For the first time in years, I felt the ground steady under me. My silence had been broken, my place reclaimed, not because they had finally seen me, but because I had chosen to see myself. If you have ever been treated as invisible, if your own family has tried to erase your worth, remember this. Justice is not always written in courtrooms. Sometimes it lives in the choices we make when no one believes we will act. Sometimes it belongs to the ones who stayed silent the longest and then found their voice. Tell me, have you ever been pushed aside and still found a way to stand taller than those who tried to keep you down?